Welcome to the Critical Christian Podcast.
We're your hosts, Dan
and Justin. We ask critical questions about the Bible and provide questionable answers.
Yes, we do.
Dan, we just finished chapter 40.
All right.
Where Joseph interprets the dream of the cupbearer and the baker while he's imprisoned for the offense against Potiphar's wife, even though it's quite clear that Potiphar himself doesn't even believe the claim. Mm-hmm. And now Joseph's going to the big show in chapter 41.
Going to the big show.
Right?
This is it. Big leagues, big times.
So he, after two years of waiting, he's finally going to get pulled up from the minors into the majors.
That's right.
Let's jump right in. Can you read verse 1 for us?
Sure. Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by a river. Wait, does that mean Joseph has been doing the prison thing for 2 years?
Yeah.
And so now the Pharaoh finally has a dream 2 years later. And since Joseph had interpreted 2 dreams 2 years ago and made a name for himself as a dream explainer or whatever, the Pharaoh's like, hey, that one guy, remember that 2 years ago? I assume maybe he's been interpreting other dreams all this time, maybe, or...
Well, that's a good point. Where if he was interpreting other dreams past the cupbearer and the baker, we don't know.
Especially since the cupbearer did not mention him, and I imagine the baker didn't really care to.
Well, I think the cupbearer does.
No, it said at the end that he forgot to mention.
Right, no, the end of the last chapter, the cupbearer does not mention Joseph.
That's what I'm saying.
But he does in this narrative, doesn't he?
Oh,
in chapter 41. It says, it came to pass in the morning that Pharaoh's spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all his wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dream, but no one could interpret it. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my fault this day when Pharaoh was angry, and so on, and then he recounts Although, interesting, in this chapter, he's called the chief butler.
Well, that was, 2 years later that he do it,
Right. It's interesting. Is chief butler the same designation as the cupbearer? I mean, I would think so. The cupbearer is the highest classification of servant.
Then I guess so. Bearing that cup. Big deal.
Right.
Pretty big.
I had a thought that because he was in prison for 2 full years before he got called up by Pharaoh. And as we discussed previously, I think this lends itself to the viewpoint, again, I don't think Potiphar believed Joseph committed a crime. Because as we talked about in the last chapter, if you committed a capital offense, you were just hung up on a pole and killed. So if it's true that he's in prison for what typically would be a capital punishment, I can only assume that Potiphar is just having him there to appease his wife and doesn't actually believe that he committed a single crime. Otherwise, he'd be dead by now. He'd be long gone.
I wouldn't.
It really makes you wonder what kind of relationship they had.
Good one.
Right.
But of course, you can't really bring it up.
Right.
Then she'll just double down. Trouble.
That's a good point. If he confronts his wife about it, she's likely to never admit her wrongdoings and just make the matter worse.
Yeah. And then probably find out in prison instead of being killed. And she'll be like, see, you didn't believe me. And then gossip all over town, and then people okay with that.
Right.
Just the whole can of worms. He was just like, forget it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was still not a nice thing. At least he.
Right. Now, here, as we've already discussed, and I don't want to make this chapter any longer than it already is, but as we've already discussed, it seems like everything that's happened so far has been orchestrated by God. So, does that mean, does God have a hand in helping Potiphar come to that decision? Because if Potiphar came to the decision that he believed his wife, well, he'd be dead.
I mean, I don't think so. I think this is just a case of this, being something that has happened more than once. Potiphar, unlike,
Sure.
I don't know if God really whispered into Potiphar's ear,
Right. Yeah, I could see that. I'm okay with that one. Yeah. Yeah.
Are we good?
Yeah. Let's read the next couple of verses.
2-7. Suddenly there came up out of so this is the Pharaoh's dream.
Yeah, this is the dream. Yep, which is repeated twice. We're only going to read it once.
Yeah, but you know what? That certainly cuts down on a lot of chapter. The girth, if you will.
Right. It's a girthy chapter.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plumping good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed, it was a dream.
Yeah.
So he had 2 dreams that meant the same thing.
Right.
Not sure why you need 2 of them. I also kind of wonder how grain stalks each other.
Yeah. I was like trying to envision, like, okay, if this was a cartoon, how would they draw it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing to work out because, like, even the cows. We know that cows can eat things,
Right.
but how would you dream of another cow eating another cow? Like, how does that look?
Yeah.
Like, I don't fully.
Just
Does
swallows
his
it up and
mouth unhinge like a snake?
probably.
Is that what happened?
Yeah.
The dream itself sounds terrifying. Either the cow's head unhinged like a snake and he swallowed the other cow's whole,
Right.
or like the cows nibbled each other one little bit at a time.
That'd be a long dream.
Until the cannibalism was complete.
Right. Let's go with
Yeah.
Sounds weird.
Now, on the idea though, why are there 2 dreams? That was a really interesting question. I scratched my head on that a little bit.
Yeah.
And I thought, maybe one dream wasn't enough for Pharaoh to make him like sufficiently alarmed.
I get that.
Because anyone can have one bad dream,
Right. Yeah.
or one strange dream. But if you have 2 of them back to back, then you're like, well, it's waking up in cold sweats. That's weird. What's going on here?
Yeah.
Maybe he was stubborn. As we see it elsewhere, like during the Exodus, he's definitely stubborn.
Is this the same guy?
No,
Oh.
definitely not the same Pharaoh. They're 400 years apart. But if we've learned anything about how pharaohs are pictured in the Bible,
Yeah.
they're all kind of a little bit stubborn. But wouldn't you be if you thought you were God manifested on
Right.
the earth?
Yeah.
I mean, you'd be a little stubborn, I guess. Yeah. So, anyways,
So I
Yeah.
assume we're to understand that God sent this dream. So do you think there was going to be 7 good years and 7 bad years, like already? Or did God have to manufacture this so Joseph could come in and interpret it and save the day? Like, what are the odds of 7 and 7? I mean, I almost wonder if they didn't just say 7 because it's special. And the reality was probably like 4 to 5 good years, whatever. Except that wouldn't explain the 7 cows. Unless, again, whoever wrote this had chosen 7 for its religious significance.
right. There's a lot of questions because, like, as you pointed out, okay, in order for God to orchestrate all this, which as we've seen so far, he's been doing that, then like, did he create the famine? Or did he know the famine was coming already and then orchestrated? He found, okay, well, this is how I can work this out, and I'll squeeze my plan into this already happening thing. But we've seen elsewhere in the Old Testament where God is always in control of the rain and in control of the land and the harvest and everything like that.
I tend to believe that these things were already going to happen. God used glory, but he didn't actually set them in. And I say that because it seems like it would be a little messed up to be like, okay, we're going to have a 7-year famine and kill off a bunch of people. Just.
So I agree with you on 2 accounts.
All right.
The first account is what Joseph himself says in Genesis 45 when he meets his brothers in Egypt because they come in because of the famine. Says, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said to them, I'm your brother Joseph, the one that you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. Well, if that's true, if God can like see the future and can orchestrate getting Joseph and his companions into Egypt so that they can survive the famine, it seems odd to me then that for the next 400 years they become slaves in Egypt.
Uh-huh.
Like, did he give up after the famine? Like, did he stop orchestrating things?
Well, things were going pretty good, and then, according to the story, the Israelites did something for God to put them in, right?
Well, we're not really told. We are told, remember earlier in Genesis, Abraham's told that his descendants will spend so many years as slaves in Egypt, and then God would deliver them. Are we to assume that this was necessary?
I don't know if it was necessary. Let me ask you a question. So people like Joseph and what have you, did they have access to or did they have knowledge of Abraham? His stories.
I would assume so. It's just like their grandfather, right?
So they would remember a prophecy of, hey, if you go into Egypt, you're going to be slaves.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know how much was communicated to them. I don't know if Abraham warned them, like, hey, don't go into Egypt or else you're going to become slaves.
Yeah.
We don't really know if they had that information. What we do know is I assume they were all told that God wanted them to possess the land of Canaan.
But we have the information. And if we have it, then somebody else must. It couldn't have just been manufactured when the writing of Genesis had to have been taken from.
You would think so.
Right. The end.
Right. So were they slaves in Egypt because they went there, they got fat and comfortable and decided we're going to stay here?
Right. Yeah, well, that's what you said, right?
Yeah, that was always my position in the past, is the enslavement in Egypt was because they were disobeying God. They were supposed to be possessing the land of Canaan. But it's just weird to me that God does like all this miracle working to get Joseph into Egypt to save his brothers and sisters, and then doesn't do anything to get them out.
I don't know. It's possible that did, but they ignored him since they had it so good.
Sure. We're not told.
Right, we're not.
Unfortunately. Anyways, there's a lot of questions that are unanswered here.
It could just be on them to know their history and know that they were supposed to, conquer Canaan, and instead didn't. So God is like, well, they know their history; they're ignoring it.
Yeah, possibly. But I have so many questions. Like, so Joseph rightly points out that all this is being orchestrated by God. God sent him ahead of them so that he can save them during the famine. But like, one of the questions I had when I was thinking through this is like, was there not a better way? Okay, if God's goal was to preserve the tribes of Israel during the famine so they wouldn't die off, is there not a better way than having Joseph sold as a slave and then put into prison for a couple of years? All this mental and emotional turmoil that you put this young man through. When you're the God of the universe and you have all the power in the universe, could you not just orchestrate something that's less traumatic?
Listen, I know that Joseph said, "It was not who you sent me here, God."
Right.
And he might have believed that. But I don't think that's actually true. I think God just knew what was going to happen and therefore tried to, go behind the scenes, make it all work for his glory, for his good, what have you. But I don't know if I would say so much that God was like, okay, Joseph, let's go ahead and get the idea into his heads that they need to kill him. Go with Reuben and say, don't. You know what I mean? I don't know if God, for this plan to have been from God, there would have been a lot of interaction with humans, right?
Well, that's what the dreams, remember, because he had to give Joseph the dreams that ticked his brothers off, right? And then all the dreams while he was in prison. So the dreams seem to be the method in which God is kind of like moving the narrative.
Yeah, but to be fair, I've had a lot of dreams. I don't think any of them have ever caused me to actually go, oh, or do something. So that was kind of on Joseph, to whether he wanted to take it to the level or. And I think that's still free will. It's like God saying, hey, do you want to do this or that? You have a choice.
Is all of this, all the hardship and turmoil in this narrative, is it necessary for character development? Because, listen, the God of the universe has got limitless power and limitless foreknowledge, okay? So if the goal was to preserve his 12 soon-to-be tribes, he could have done that 100 different ways. He didn't have to send them into Egypt. So I guess what I'm saying is,
well, the goal is to have a story to tell, right?
Well, maybe. I guess the question is, was this a necessary part of the narrative? Could God have done what he needed to do in history without this? For example, if he preserved them in the land of Canaan by just abating the famine, and Joseph was never sold into Egypt, they never went down there, and they never became slaves in Egypt, do you still get to the same endpoint? Do you still get the 12 tribes of Israel taking over the promised land? Like, was this required?
It would probably happen a little more quickly, right? Then again,
and naturally,
or
with less bloodshed.
Or, if these 7 years of famine were going to happen, God did not orchestrate them. That's just how things are going to happen. Then God would have to find a way to save Joseph, right?
Well, that's what I'm saying is whether or not God caused the famine might be irrelevant because he has the power to uncause it.
Yeah, but we're assuming that. God doesn't do that.
Well, he does. He says over and over again in the prophets, like in Amos and Jeremiah, he says, you rebelled against me, I withheld the rain from you, I made your crops dry up, and yet you did not turn to me. He talks about using the weather and the fertility of the land all the time to sort of guide the direction of his people.
Fine.
Right? So God has the power of ending the famine. Like,
oh, of course he does. But I guess that's where he wanted the story to lead then. That's exactly what you're saying, right?
That's what I'm trying to figure out is like, if God has the power to do it a different way,
right,
but he chose to do it this way, does that mean that this method was necessary? And if this method was necessary, then what is the necessary component? Was there a lesson that they needed to learn? Was there like some sort of character growth that needed to happen? Was this required to set up the Exodus? Because remember, in the Exodus narrative, he hardens Pharaoh's heart about 6 different times, and he says so that the signs and wonders can be displayed among the people.
Right.
Was all of this being orchestrated ahead of time so that God could show off with the plagues and demonstrate to the world that he's like the mightiest God of the planet? Or
yes, he was thinking of the long term.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds bad when you question. Okay,
You know,
if you don't question, it's not that bad.
the problem is we're in a section of the text that seems to be heavily impregnated with like predestinationism. You know what I mean? And so it's just it's very difficult to figure out how much is being predestined and how much is being free willed by humanity, and where does one start and the other stop? You know what I mean? And if it's true that God predestined X, Y, and Z, well, why didn't he also predestine A, B, and C? Like we're not really told how he picks and chooses what gets predestined and, you know, what gets free willed. It's a little messy.
If so if someone were to ask, well, like if I were talking with other Christians about Exodus, you know, I would ask them, I would say, so, you know, why did the Exodus have to happen? Why did they have to become slaves? You know, I assume what they would tell me was because the Israelites got complacent and all, and so that was their sin, was not going in and conquering Canaan. Okay, and so
Right.
that is literally what's happening right now.
Right.
I don't know if that's God orchestrating anything. He
Right.
figured out a plan to save Joseph and his family. It was up to them whether they wanted to stay there and have people hate them, or realize that, okay, this has been good for a time, but it's, you know, time to get back in with God.
I think that's the most reasonable answer, and that's kind of where I've always kind of rested my hat as well. But it's just one of those things where it's kind of like, you're like, if you have this all powerful being, I just always feel like I kind of would have done something different in a way that would have minimized the amount of pain and suffering of everybody involved.
Yeah, obviously, but maybe that's only because God again was working
Right.
throughout. I mean, I don't know how much he orchestrates. I guess, more of that things happen, and works with them.
Yeah.
That's the. You're talking about how they didn't even need Joseph, but the famine was going to happen and was going to kill the 12 tribes. Then they probably needed to save them, right?
Right. But to your point and to what I was saying earlier is, if the goal is to preserve the 12 tribes,
Yes,
and you have all the power in the universe, could you not have saved them without enslaving the entire nation?
obviously you could have, but two things. One, it's not God's fault that they got enslaved.
Right.
Right? Do we agree that it was the Israelites?
It seems to be their fault.
Right.
Right.
Okay. And two, what were we talking about?
We're just throwing out options. What are was there a better alternative than
And two, I know that he's all powerful and can do whatever he wants, but I also think he doesn't.
He holds back.
Right. I mean, because
he limits himself.
Yes, very much so.
I think it's fair. Yeah.
I mean, I would be lying if I said I didn't have a problem with him hardening Pharaoh's heart.
Yeah, when we get to that part of Exodus, I think chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, it gets pretty rough with the whole hardening of the heart thing, because it's clear that Pharaoh was softening his heart during the process, and God's like, no, you don't. Not yet, buddy.
And yeah, I don't think I've seen that anywhere else. I don't know if that's true, but I feel like that may be the only time where certain God intervened and that out.
He definitely intervened with the free will of mankind during that particular narrative, and that's why Paul picks up on that in Romans chapter 9. But that's a discussion for a later time. I think we probably beat this horse.
Yeah, I'm just saying
sufficiently
later
dead.
on it'll be a problem, but for right now we're good.
Right.
If I pretend that it never happened, that there's no Exodus story, then this still makes sense.
Right. It's also possible, and this is the last thing I'll say on it, it's also possible that God wanted the Exodus to happen. You know what I mean? Like that could have just been something he wanted to happen.
Yeah. I mean, it makes for a pretty good story.
I mean, it's one of the best movies of the was Cecil, what was his name? The guy who
DeMille?
Yeah, Cecil DeMille, is that his name?
I believe so.
Yeah, that's one of the best movies of the Cecil DeMille era.
And of course the cartoon, The Prince of Egypt.
Oh, of course. I mean, you think of and Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I mean, think of all the amazing performances we have from that section of the Old Testament. If you ask anybody, even if they're a Christian or not, if you know anything from the Old Testament, they're going to say, well, like Adam and Eve and Moses.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, yeah, you had a question.
Did I?
On here.
So, who would be writing?
Yeah. Well, it's a very complicated question, which we're not going to answer today.
Glad I asked it.
But my understanding is that this was an oral tradition that lasted for centuries before it was written down. And if I had to guess, and most scholars agree, this section of Genesis was a northern tradition held by Israel, not so much by Judah and Benjamin. So the first people to write this down were probably the northern tribes, which of course, if you read through the Joseph narrative, Yahweh hardly shows up. It's always Elohim, Yep.
I think Harper's right.
And if you go through all of the Elohim sections in the first 5 books, dreams are a repeat feature. Dreams happen over and over again, as well as lots of favor being shown to Joseph and his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh.
So is it possible nobody ever actually had dreams? And that's just how the narrator got the information? You know what I mean?
Do you think the narrator made it all up?
Well, no, this stuff happened, but that the narrator decided it would have come to them.
Oh, now that is possible. But
because it seems like an element writing pretty often.
Right.
So it's hard to tell if it was just that here's how they got the information.
Sure.
I don't know.
It's possible the narrator could be filling in some really big gaps. Possible that it happened exactly the way it was told.
Yeah, I mean, since we're streaming, I can't really edit all stupid things I say out. But
No, I'm with you.
Trust me, if I could, I don't really.
Right. I think you're smart. Don't worry.
So I know you'll say it was fairly common to have good years and bad years. So it may have been just like a 50-50 chance, and Joseph figured that since the harvest was good now, it would probably remain that way for a while until it all starts to die. So I'm just saying that this, you didn't really need to have divine knowledge, I mean, if you have a good harvest, it's a good chance it's not going to last forever.
Right.
And as I said before, it might not have been 7 years exactly.
Exactly. That's a good point. I didn't get around to addressing that, but the 7 might not have been a literal number. It might actually be referring to some sort of divine imagery using the number 7. It might have been a famine for 2 or 3 years. We don't really know.
I mean, that really feels like what the narrator would have had.
It does. I actually agree with that. The whole story, there's a lot of like implausible bits in the story. But like, I was thinking about this, like, what are the chances that the way that the narrator tells the story is literally just how it went down? Because that's possible. And I was thinking like about Nelson Mandela. Dude, okay, so Nelson Mandela was imprisoned multiple times. And he spent over 27 years accumulatively in prison, in probably what felt like a hopeless era, and then becomes the first freaking elected president of the after the apartheid ends. It was in the mid 90s, 1994. Becomes the first president of South Africa. You could not have told a single individual in 60 or 70 that Nelson Mandela was going to be the next. It was going to be the apartheid is going to end, and Nelson Mandela was going to be president.
Right.
The most implausible thing that could have left your mouth. So if we can see like those types of things happening in real life, it's possible that this narrative legitimately just happened the way the narrator says it did.
Yeah. I got nothing.
I mean, we'll touch on this later, but we know that like people from the land of Canaan quite often went into Egypt, and some of them rose to power. So,
right, I get that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there's evidence that Joseph was real.
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with Joseph being a real person. I think the 12 tribes are probably go back to a real ancestor. Now, that doesn't mean that the narrative that we get about those ancestors are 100% correct, but I'm inclined to believe that they came from real people.
I think maybe they came from real people, but that it wasn't just one who had 12 sons.
Right. Actually, to your point, that's commonly held even in like conservative academic circles, where they still believe that 12 tribes came from a single individual. Most of them held or they hold to the idea that it's probably not likely that they actually all came from the same ancestor. That's probably just a narrative that was used to tie the 12 tribes together to unite them.
Oh, look, there's a person in our chat.
Yeah, I know, Pacer.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, stay on task. We're reading.
Oh, sorry.
I know you're distracted. It's okay.
Fine.
Genesis 41, 8 through 13, eh?
All right. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. Then Pharaoh was angry with when Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and put me in the custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream, and one night he and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now dreamed according to the, yeah.
Mhm.
Now there was a younger Hebrew man with us here, there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass just as he interpreted for us. So it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him.
What a pleasant narrative.
Right.
He restored me and killed the other guy.
Yeah. So I'm saying interpreting dreams is not hard.
So
Just say some really vague stuff like the cows mean food because they're cows and wing it. You're telling me nobody in the whole city could pull something out of their behind that sounded halfway believable?
well, that was my thing was like, okay, so like interpreting the dream of Pharaoh seems easy because we already know the interpretation. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
But if we didn't know the interpretation of the dream already, it might seem like incredibly vague and non-detailed
But
enough.
you know what? They had a lot of people there who, they probably interpreted other dreams. Or whatever. The point is,
It was common,
why
yeah.
couldn't they just make something up?
Well, they could, but if it didn't come true, they'd be killed.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, so that's the thing is Joseph didn't just give them an interpretation; he gave them the interpretation,
Okay.
and that's what makes it interesting. Anyone could just say that, well, this is what your dream means.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we have ancient records from Babylon, from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, where he asked for prophecies to be given. He didn't like the prophecies, and he just unalived the prophets. Just said, "We're done with you." And then there was another occasion, I forget which one of the Babylonian kings summoned the prophets to decide whether or not he needed to go to war against a particular town. And they said, go to war. And then it failed. They couldn't take the town and came back and killed all the prophets. So like, if you gave the wrong interpretation or a bad prophetic message, like the king could just off your head, man.
If he does something like that, he's basically asking for people to lie to him, though.
Well,
So that's
you're not asking someone to lie for you, because if the king wants your prophecy and your prophecy proves to be untrue, then you're dead, right? Because that means you're a false prophet.
Mm-hmm.
So you're better to just say, well, I don't have anything for you. Right? If the king says, I have this dream, can you interpret it? And if you don't have the answer, the best thing you can say is, I'm sorry, God hasn't spoken to me on this. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Because if you're wrong, it's pretty risky.
So maybe that's what was going on over there.
That was my thought.
They didn't know for certain, and they didn't want to die.
Right. They didn't know for certain. That's why it says nobody could interpret the dream.
And so Joseph is really sticking his neck out on this one, literally, because he could get it chopped off.
Yeah, think about, okay, so that was the other thing. It's not just that Joseph could interpret the dream, it's that he could do so under that amount of pressure.
Yeah.
Could you imagine risking having a wooden pole shoved up your rear end to impale you on the side of the road if you got the dream wrong?
Yeah.
You could go the way of the baker. You could be hung up on the pole and have the birds peck your eyes out.
I'd be like, I know what it means, but I ain't telling you.
Right.
I ain't telling you.
Right. I don't know if I'd be that ballsy.
Well, maybe not.
So anyways.
I'd be thinking it.
Yeah. That's all I had to say about that.
All right.
Verse 17, eh?
Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of a river. I'm kind of surprised that they decided to just rewrite the very long dream that we heard of only in verses 1 through 7. So 10 verses later. Couldn't they have just said, and Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams?
Right. So in this particular section of text, the redactor that put this narrative together goes through painstaking efforts to put together literary devices that we've already discussed before, like chiasms and inclusios. And as it turns out, the bulk of this chapter forms a rough chiasm, where the very center of the structure is always the very most important part. Okay. It works its way in, then it works its way out. And that center point is the most important point. And the center point of the chiasm for this chapter says, "So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, 'It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace.'" And so the focal point of this chapter needs to be on God, who is capable of giving you the answer to your questions and your peace.
And I hate that.
God is the focal point of this whole narrative.
I think people can figure that out without having to read this big block of text 3 times, right?
I know it's hard because a lot of times a chiasm is just like one sentence in and out. The entire dream serves as a whole block of the chiasm.
Right. That's
And I thought to myself, well, maybe this was for a memory device, but I was thinking about the other dreams in Genesis. None of the other dreams in Genesis are repeated. This is the only time we see it where the identical dream is just repeated word for word, like that. So, and it's not that important of a dream.
So it basically is just the narrator to flower it up.
It's artistry.
Yeah.
It's artistry. Yep. For sure.
Okay.
There's been quite a few papers written on the structure of the Joseph narrative. It's actually one of the few narratives, long narratives in the Bible that seems to be compiled by one editor.
Okay.
It's wild. Yeah.
Would have to be one editor, right? I assume other editors would be like, whoa.
Yeah.
Do we get all of it?
You can usually see like the Noah narrative. The Noah narrative jumps back and forth between at least 2 different textual traditions that were kind of haphazardly weaved together, as we've already noted when we were covering that part of Genesis. The Joseph narrative, not so much. You can tell it's mostly put together by one person. It uses the same type of language, the same type of imagery, So let's move on to 25 through 32. We're not going to read the dream all over again, though.
Hope not. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7. Wait, what? The 7. Oh, the heads. Yeah, that makes sense. The stalks of wheat or what have you.
Right.
I don't know why you couldn't have just said that.
I don't know.
All right. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all of the land of Egypt. But after them, 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Wow.
Right?
Yes.
Aren't glad we only read that once?
Yeah.
I always see Kelly up in here now. Welcome in, Kelly.
Focus on this.
Sorry, I get really distracted. This is not TikTok. I can't talk to people. So what are your thoughts on the dream here?
I got nothing because we already talked about it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've already talked about the dream of Pharaoh. Let's talk about the interpretation in verses 33 to 36.
Oh, good. All right. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land, for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, and the land may not perish during the famine. You were saying that you had to really put a lot of faith in the prophets. And this guy really did, because, this is a prophecy that's going to take a long time to see effect. Right. And yet he was still like, all right, let's do it right away,
Yeah.
Was he thinking, all right, we'll do it, but I'm going to kill you if this doesn't work out?
So that's the interesting thing is, like, so the Pharaoh gets the interpretation from Joseph for the dreams. He has no way of knowing if the interpretation is correct.
Right.
right? So like he just out of nowhere, he's like, yeah, we're just gonna do this thing, and I'm gonna trust you with my entire kingdom.
Right. Yeah.
But like he has no way of knowing Joseph's got revelation from God.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's a kind of implausible story, and this is one of those plot holes. You know what I mean? It's like, wait a minute. Wouldn't he want to test Joseph with something small first?
That would make a lot of sense.
It's wild to think about that. And the other thing was like, so you pointed out here when Joseph says, "Let someone select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt." I can't believe that when Joseph uttered those words, that he was hoping that he would be selected. You know what I mean? But I mean, that's exactly what happened. But it's hard to tell because remember, Joseph he's a dreamer, and he thinks that God is with him. But like, could you imagine like if that was what Joseph was thinking? Joseph is like, listen, I'm gonna make a suggestion to Pharaoh, and I'm gonna set myself up, so that Pharaoh will select me to be like, over the whole land. And then what if it didn't happen? I mean, can you imagine how disappointing it was? Like, I got this really cool interpretation from God. Pharaoh's going to hook me up, and then
now my head will be on a pike.
Yeah. And then, oops, womp womp, someone else got picked.
Right. Yeah. That was God's whole, it's just like a long.
Right. It's a long con, yeah.
Giggling. All right.
All right. 37 through 41.
Yep.
All right, let's get her done.
So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" What? Who's he talking about? What's this about?
Start from 37 again.
So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And then Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?"
Right.
Well, didn't he already interpret his dream for him? Did I miss this?
Right. Yeah. So Pharaoh is saying, "Hey, listen, this wise man said to set somebody up who's discerning over the land of Egypt." And he's like, okay. "Well, can we find somebody that's not as good as this Joseph? Why not pick him?" Right.
Okay. We had just been talking about it so much, I assumed Joseph had already interpreted it for him.
He did interpret the dream, but now... So let's go back to what you read. So he interpreted the dream, and then he says, therefore, let Pharaoh, now he gives a recommendation, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt.
And then Joseph's over there going, I happen to be discerning and wise. Just saying.
Right, exactly. And then the plan obviously worked because Pharaoh's like,
right, yeah.
I can't see anybody around me who would be such discerning and wise.
Right.
Why not this guy, right? Mm-hmm. But let's actually read the whole thing.
Oh, there's more.
Yeah.
All right. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all of the land of Egypt." That's crazy.
Right.
So Pharaoh's basically like, hey, let's make this random Jewish guy who's been in prison for 2 years for attempted, whatever, ruler over everything and everyone. Hell, and my second in command, sidestepping my captain of the guard and whoever else I may piss off with this decision.
I mean, it seems super plausible, doesn't it?
Yeah, so much.
Because remember later in the narrative, when the brothers come to Egypt, they won't even serve food to the brothers of Joseph and the Egyptians at the same table because they won't even be seen eating with the Hebrews. So just like, the Jews wouldn't eat with the Gentiles, the Egyptians would not eat with those filthy Canaanite people.
I mean, there would be some sort of an upheaval. They'd want to overthrow the Pharaoh at this point, right? If he's given all this power to a Jew.
Yeah, so that's the thing is, it's not just that he gave power to a Hebrew, it's just that they also like really looked down on Hebrews. Like they were dirty, and like they wore animal skins, which was a big no-no for the Egyptians.
What do they wear?
Well, they wore plant products, so like they would even use like reeds for like reed skirts and whatnot.
That's probably a better idea.
Yeah, and so like for example, in the Egyptian temples, you were not allowed to wear animal skin as clothing because it was considered impure.
Okay.
Right? And so there's a lot of customs and practices of the Canaanite people, also the Hebrews, that the Egyptians found detestable. That's why they wouldn't even eat with them at the same table.
How come God didn't find that impure to wear animal skins? And yet the Egyptians did. I mean, they don't even have a real God to talk to, you know?
Well, I'm sure everybody in the ancient world had a different conception of what was clean and what was not clean. The Hittites had their own conception of clean and unclean as well. Right? Everybody kind of thought they knew. That's like the pig. Everyone wants to know why it was that the pig was an unclean animal. And my personal opinion, from some ancient literature that I've been able to gather, is that it's because pigs didn't have fur, and so when they got skin diseases, you could see the skin disease right on the outside of the pig.
I mean, that's pretty good.
And so they were known to be susceptible to getting what they called leprosy. But really, any skin disease would have been called leprosy.
So they were just eating all kinds of stuff. They just, figured it was fine because they couldn't see its skin.
Basically, yeah. If you shaved like your average cattle, you could have seen as many skin deformities in the skin of the cattle as you would a pig.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do?
Yeah. So, wasn't that a rule from God though, to not eat pigs?
That was a rule from God. Yeah.
So that's Leviticus, right?
Yeah, I forget where that rule gets doled out, but I'm pretty sure it is in Leviticus. There's a bunch of clean and unclean animals listed in Leviticus.
All right, we'll just have to talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll slog through that.
That's it. Yeah.
Right. But it is odd, as you say, that Joseph is just randomly catapulted to the top. Even if Pharaoh believed that the dream interpretation came from God, even if he believed that still, like, your first instinct wouldn't be, let's take this dude that nobody knows.
This is career suicide.
And just put him in second in
I'm not allowed to
charge.
say that word, am I?
I don't know. It's YouTube. Who knows?
All right.
But like, it's a very implausible position to put this nobody. Right?
And that's why other Christians would say, I know, that's why it's so miraculous.
I guess. Well, if God can harden Pharaoh's heart in Exodus, I guess he can soften Pharaoh's heart in Genesis to get Joseph.
That's true. Maybe he's
where he needs to be.
There'll be a lot of softening, huh?
It definitely seems to be. Well, let's read.
I like that.
Sure.
It should have said, and God softened Pharaoh's heart so that he would make Joseph like in charge.
Right.
That would certainly make a lot more sense than whatever this is going on.
Right. I mean, I don't know. We'll talk. I got more to say about what's happening here.
All right, let's just do this. 41 to 42. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Another example of signets being used to authenticate a person, just like Jacob. I guess it's not much different than modern ID cards, since those two can be forged, but it is still fairly difficult.
You mean like Judah and Tamar? when she
Yeah,
took.
that's what I said. I said Judah.
Exactly.
You heard Jacob, but I said Judah.
Of course, it was
All
my
right.
area.
Mm-hmm. So what they should have done is have someone etch a picture of a person into like the stone or clay to accompany the signet.
Well,
right?
that did happen sometimes, actually.
I bet it's really easy to change your identity, at least. I mean, you get caught and just be like, hey, I'm whatever. And then they got to find this other guy and talk to the friends and family and see if they know him by a different name. It just seems like such a convoluted way to determine identity. Like, say a child was born and didn't get assigned a social security number and then wanted to sign up for a boat loan. How would they do it? I don't know. It was probably easier to live off the grid back then. Just buy a horse and ride a few miles away and start a new life. You'll probably never see anyone you knew again, right?
Well, the signet is not something that like everybody had.
Right, but
like, so if you were an official, you would have something, a signet roller or a signet ring.
Was Judah an official?
Well, he would.
I thought he was just like kind of wealthy.
Well, he was wealthy. He was a head of a household, of an important household.
There's a lot of heads of household. They're called husbands,
but
right?
If you're the head of a household or a kingdom or anything like that, you need something to seal like your letters. You need something to. So like if I'm the king and I send a letter to somebody, I'm going to stamp it with my signet ring.
Right.
And then later, if someone questions the authenticity of that letter, they can bring the seal and they can compare it to my signet and verify, no, this is indeed a letter from the king. Now, it's also true that because kings like Pharaoh sent out many, many letters, that quite often he had people designated with his signet ring. He had multiple signet rings, and they could sign. And in fact, if you look at the clay tablets from ancient Babylon and Assyria, if you go to the judicial rulings, because a lot of the judicial rulings were written out on the Akkadian tablets, you would actually see on the side or the bottom of the clay tablet, you would see the seal of either the judge that presided over it or the seal of the king pressed into the clay tablet so that they can take that home with them. They can take that summary judgment with them. And then later, if there was a legal dispute, they can take that same clay tablet and say, look, no, this is what the judge decreed in our case. It's got the names of the witnesses. It's got the signet ring pressed into it. This is an official judgment. This is not something that was forged. And so the signet ring was more for like official business than it was like an ID card that you would just whip out if you needed to go buy beer.
Right.
Does that make sense? Yeah. And not everybody would have one, right? Like your average Joe didn't need a signet ring. What were they trying to prove? They couldn't send a letter anyway. They didn't know how to read or write.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, so if you can't read or write, the odds that you would need a signet ring are pretty low.
Gotcha.
So yeah, that's what's going on there. So anyways, the fact that Pharaoh just gives away his signet ring to this schmuck Hebrew dude from prison.
I mean, he hasn't even shown that his prophecy has come true.
Right. The Pharaoh doesn't even know if the damn prophecy is going to come true yet.
Right, yeah.
He doesn't know it. He's putting everything on the line here for this dude. I mean, you have to wonder what people saw in this Joseph character, because Potiphar didn't even believe his own wife that she was raped by Joseph.
Oh, you can't say that word, right?
On YouTube, you can say anything you want, I think. I don't know. Who knows?
Okay.
But Potiphar didn't believe it. We both know Potiphar did not believe the accusation. And so if Potiphar is like going to shame his own wife for making false accusations, and the Pharaoh is just going to willy-nilly give him his freaking signet ring, it really makes you wonder, like, was he super handsome or something? Like, what's the deal here?
I bet he was.
Like,
I bet he was.
Was he just like wooing everybody with his words? Like,
you know what? I was at the Goodwill earlier, and I saw some guy who kind of looked like a dude. And he had a girlfriend who was hot. He walked past me, and you know what he said? He said, "Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry."
Oh, he's very polite.
And then I'm like, oh, you know what? This guy's all right.
Oh, yeah.
So I was just thinking maybe that was like Joseph, where he just knew what to say.
What if, you're right. What if he was just one of those guys who just always knew what to tell you?
Yeah.
Like you walked in the room and he made you feel like $100.
Right, yeah.
You're like, hey, that's a gorgeous new shirt you're wearing today. Your hair looks really nice today. What if he was that guy?
Yeah.
That made everybody, like, he was the guy everybody wanted to be around.
Maybe he was just always in a good mood because he knew that God would protect him.
Could have been.
I mean, that would be pretty cool, right? To know that you're destined for things and God is going to protect you and not just going to suddenly die of a heart attack or anything,
Yeah, but up to this point, does it appear that God has done anything for him?
No, he hasn't been killed.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying, though, he went from being the favored son of his father to being sold as a slave to Egypt and then being falsely accused of sexual assault.
I guess you're right about that.
It's not exactly turning out great for him,
at
least up until this particular point. But he's still sweating balls because we don't know if his dream interpretation is true yet.
Right, yeah. So this seems very implausible.
Yeah, so far it's kind of implausible. I don't know. Let's read 43.
I mean, maybe that's why, we're talking about why God would, have to set up this scenario. Maybe it's just none of this is true.
Or maybe it's just, God doing God things.
Yeah, God doing God things. Thank you for that. All right. 41 to 43, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Hey, is bowing the knee the same as regular bowing? Now, were they saying Joseph should bow to the Pharaoh?
No.
Okay.
Pharaoh is actually instructing the other Egyptians to bow the knee to Joseph.
Man, I wouldn't. You know what? Here's the thing, though. Is that a sin for them?
No.
Because wouldn't God be like, whoa, you bow only to me? So,
Well, I don't think they were worshiping Joseph. I think they were giving him respect and honor. Although, if you read the correspondence letters, there's about 315 correspondence letters called the Amarna tablets that were written between the petty kings in Canaan and also between the Egyptian Pharaoh. You should see the introduction to a lot of these letters. A lot of them start out like, your servant so-and-so, I am the dirt between your toes. I worship at your feet 7 times on my face and 7 times on my back. Like, holy crap, talk about groveling.
Right.
And there's a couple letters where the people writing the letter to the Pharaoh literally refer to the Pharaoh as the sun god. You are my sun god. So it's definitely, the Pharaoh would definitely kind of take on worship, but I'm not sure to what effect that would have been true of anybody but the Pharaoh.
I guess there are 2 different types of bows, right? One was like, and one where you're really prostrate.
Yeah.
Prostrate?
Yeah, definitely don't mix it up with prostate.
Right.
That's a different type of maneuver.
It is.
But yeah, so I don't think they were worshiping Joseph, but they were definitely giving him the same respect that the Pharaoh would have got, which is baffling because, again, nobody knows if his prophecy or his prediction is even true yet.
Yeah. This really does feel like a softening of the heart.
Doesn't it?
Or just...
It could be. Could be both.
I don't think so. All right.
Verse 44.
All right. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Is it just me, or is this crazy? Just the audacity to give Joseph so much power when, there must have been people closer in the line of succession. We already know that God was going to favor Joseph and all, but, as we mentioned, I don't know if he was softening his heart. If he can harden a heart, I presume he can soften one. But it's again taking somebody's free will away. And I don't know. Whatever. There's really nothing to say on some of these things because I don't know what the answer is.
Right.
And neither do you, even though you know pretty much everything.
I don't know everything, but
I said pretty much.
just pretty much.
Yeah.
So the story is kind of implausible, although I wanted to point out that like it wasn't implausible for people from the land of Canaan to like get raised up in Egypt.
Why not? You said that the Egyptians thought they were just terrible people, right?
Right. Well, listen though, what the Egyptians would do, especially during this time period, is they would take daughters in marriage from the petty kings in Canaan. They would never give their daughters to marriage. That didn't happen because they were filthy, except to the Hittites. There was some intermarrying between the Egyptians and the Hittites, but the people that lived in Canaan, it was very uncouth for the Egyptians to give their daughters in marriage to them, but they would take their daughters in marriage, and then when they made an alliance between the leader of a city, typically through marriage, they would also take like one of their sons into Egypt when they were born, when they were very young, and they would raise them up to be a good Egyptian.
Okay.
And then they would send them back to rule and reign over that city-state and be a good vassal of the Egyptian state. And one of the most famous cases is a guy named Ben Ozin, who rose to be a high official, even within the court of Merneptah. He didn't go back to the land of Canaan. He stayed an official in Egypt, even though he wasn't Egyptian by birth. This was roughly the same time as the Exodus, about 1200 to 1225 BCE is when this guy lived. And so we know that, like from history even, that people from the land of Canaan, under the right circumstances, could rise to power within Egypt. I just think that the story that you and I are reading, there's some implausible plot holes, like the fact that Joseph rose to power without having any validation that he's right.
Is it possible that the narrative just truncated the events and that it took a lot longer for the Pharaoh to actually trust Joseph?
Yes, it's possible that the narrative is truncated. A lot of information is missing. We've seen this throughout Genesis so far, where there's like when they return from Jacob's uncle's place, from Laban's place, there's some plot holes. There's some geographical pieces missing where you would expect there to be a narrative of them moving from the east side of the Jordan to the west side of the Jordan, but it's not there.
Right. Yeah, I remember.
So I think there's something similar that could be happening in the Joseph narrative where there's just kind of, the story might have been longer at one point.
Joseph performed other miracles.
Yeah. That's true. It's possible that this was not the only dream that he interpreted for the Pharaoh. This is just what's gotten to us through history.
Yeah, right.
Right?
This is the story they I care about,
right.
Not the other one.
But again, you only got so much parchment to use.
Right, yeah.
Eventually you run out of places to write, and you gotta figure out what you're gonna pull out and what you're gonna keep.
Right. So like pull out like his miracles, but keep the dream 3 times.
Yeah. Keep the longest dream of the whole sequence 3 times.
Yeah.
That's not a waste of ink at all.
Right.
41
to 45.
Yeah, 41 to 45.
45. Just 45.
Right, yeah.
And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zapnath Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Pharaoh, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Man, that is an ugly name. Joseph was good as a solid name. And he's just like, all hail Zapnath, your new overlord, or something. Couldn't you see that being the name of an evil invading alien?
Yeah.
Zapnath.
That was not a name upgrade.
No.
Actually, I don't think so at all.
Is it downgrade? So I assume this was either done to mask his Jewish heritage. Wow, I can't.
It is, yes.
Mask his Jewish heritage, or by the author so the rest of the story can make sense. Bam.
It's definitely an effort to Egyptianize Joseph. And we know even from history and archaeology that when foreigners were taken into the Egyptian culture, especially if you rose into the ranks, you would be expected to Egyptianize yourself. Mm-hmm. But like here's the weird thing though, even with what they did with Joseph, the weird thing for me is like, why did they just throw a wife at him?
Oh yeah, that's true.
And I mean, we're led to believe from the story that they didn't know each other.
Right.
Like, it's not like they were to casually seeing each other. And then Pharaoh's like, hey, wink, wink, maybe that cute little Egyptian lady over there. No, he was a prisoner. So he went from prisoner to like, second in command over the whole territory. And then Pharaoh's like, hey, take this side piece, take this chick, and she's yours now.
Right.
So I guess they treated women just like everybody else did in the ancient world, which is they don't actually have any consent.
Well, I mean, it was probably, some sort of
arrangement.
No, like a nice thing, It's like a basket of fruit and like a wife,
Right.
I doubt,
because they're roughly the equal value in the ancient world.
That's what I'm saying,
Yeah.
I doubt they thought about it as much as we did.
Right. No, I agree. I think just giving women away as prizes is pretty par for the course in the ancient world. We don't see any deviation away from that in the Bible. But here's the other thing too is the name of the father-in-law is Potiphera, which is really close to Potiphar.
Oh, wait a minute.
Says and he gave him as a wife.
Dude, that's Potiphar right there.
I know.
That's Potiphar. That's it. That's weird.
Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera,
that's
priest
weird.
of On.
But he wasn't a priest, right?
Exactly. It's definitely a different person.
What's On? Is that a place?
It's a city. So,
are you sure it was a different person though?
Yeah.
You tell me that's just a coincidence?
It's definitely a different person.
Is it?
So it's a different person, but even if it is a different person, isn't it odd that now Joseph's father-in-law has almost the identical name of his slave master? That's got to be a rough one to look your father-in-law in the face all the time, and then he's got the same name as the guy who purchased you as a slave.
Maybe a common name back then, Potiphar?
Probably, yeah. The Egyptians cycled through a lot of common names. For example, if you go through the Joseph narrative and the Moses narrative, you can pick out quite a few common Egyptian names, like even the names of Aaron's two sons, not Aaron's sons. Who was the father of Phineas? And what's Phineas's brother's name? I already forget.
Verb?
Not Phineas and Ferb, no. Well, I think Nadab and Abihu were the sons of Aaron. I think those were Egyptian names, but there's two other children, Phineas and somebody else, that were super Egyptian names. And Moses, of course, is an Egyptian name.
I guess it would have to be.
Right.
Since he was raised Egyptian. Wow, this never ends.
Right. So yeah, I mean, the Potiphar and Potiphera were probably pretty common Egyptian names.
Yeah.
I just thought it was kind of a painful to...
No, you know what? No. I think they were probably the same person.
You think it's the same person?
This is the captain of the guard / priest.
Well, it's spelled differently.
Not that much differently.
I mean, it's a different name, and one was a priest, and the other one was the captain of the guard.
No, I'm just saying maybe he had two jobs. That's all I'm saying.
It seems unlikely.
We'll
agree to disagree on this one. All right. Move on.
50 to 52. And to Joseph were born two sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. Hold on. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. This is not very interesting, but I'm including this because I assume these names are going to be important later, or why would they have mentioned them? I guess they're both, they're tribes. Ephraim
Right.
is at least, right?
Both of them.
Which is weird since,
And they're kind of important. In fact, the most important king of the north, Jeroboam, after the split between the north and the south, was from the tribe of Ephraim.
Ephraim? I was saying Ephraim.
You can, any way you want to say it, Ephraim's fine too.
That's an ugly name. All right.
It's not exactly a pretty name.
No.
But both of these boys get an allotment in the land. There's no allotment in the land of Israel for Joseph.
Oh.
Think about that. Think of the 12 tribes that have allotments in the land. There's no allotment for Joseph. Joseph gets a double portion because the blessing is taken from the oldest, which is typically Reuben. Right? But Reuben slept with his father's maidservant or his wife, so he's punished. So the double portion goes to Joseph, but oddly enough, it doesn't actually go to Joseph. It goes to Joseph's two sons.
Why would it go to Joseph anyhow?
Ephraim and Manasseh.
He's the youngest. Isn't there somebody after Reuben?
Because he's the favored.
Yeah, but
Right?
he was favored at the beginning. Did Jacob still favor him at the end?
Yeah, Joseph has always been the favored son, which is odd that he himself didn't get an allotment of land that actually went to his two children.
Okay, so why is that?
Well, there's a couple reasons why it could be. A lot of people have theorized because the tribe of Joseph never actually existed, but that's neither here nor there. It's possible also that they needed to keep the number of the tribes at 12. And since Levi never got an allotment of land, the Levites didn't get an allotment of land, then you still needed a way to get 12 different allotments of land. And so you took one of the tribes and you split it into two, and now you've got 12 allotments of land. So that's a theory as well.
Because the Levites were like priests.
Yeah, the Levites were the priests until they were basically exiled after the death of Abiathar in the south, and then they were sent to the northern kingdom. But even in the northern kingdom, the king of the north didn't really give them a whole lot of respect. They didn't really gain any power or prominence again until the northern kingdom got wiped out in 722 by the Assyrians, and then they migrated back south again, back into Judah, so that they wouldn't be killed by the Assyrian king, and then they integrated into the social life there in Judah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's great.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't know half as much as you know, so
you're gonna know everything I know eventually.
I'm trying. All right, 55. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to do, do." And I'm sorry, Mr. Pharaoh, but I think you mean the great Zapna.
Yeah, okay, so as we've witnessed already in Genesis, a lot of times when somebody's name is changed, they start using that new name. This name
never comes up again, right?
Yeah, it never comes up again. What the hell is even the point of keeping it in here,
right,
if he's not going to use it? Like, was this valuable information for somebody at some point?
Yeah.
Or are they going to go back and check the Egyptian records?
Yeah.
I don't understand. Anyways, it's interesting to me as well that the narrator just chooses never to go back to this name, even though that's technically his new name.
Are there Egyptian records?
We do have Egyptian records.
Is there a Zapnath?
No, we don't have Egyptian records of Joseph.
Oh.
But we do have Egyptian records from this early time period of the people called the Hyksos, who rose to power in Egypt. They were from the land of Canaan. They rose to power and they became so powerful that they actually were a dynastic people within the land of Egypt, and eventually they were expelled from Egypt because they grew so powerful.
Dynastic means dynasty.
Yeah, exactly. So just like the narrative we have in the book of Genesis and Exodus of the the 12 tribes growing so numerous that they were able to take hold power in Egypt. That narrative actually did happen with the Hyksos people. Like that's a real thing that happened. So a lot of people think that the expulsion of the Hyksos might have been the genesis of the Exodus narrative.
Okay.
See what I did there?
I get that. Oh, yes, I do. It took me. Genesis of the Exodus. That's great.
Yeah.
All right. We ready for the final one?
Yeah, let's read the last verse.
The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became so severe in the land of Egypt. So they collected more food than usual from all the people for 7 years. And when a famine hits, they just start selling the food back to their own people.
It seems a little bit cruel, doesn't it?
I read about a guy during the pandemic that bought like a garage full of hand sanitizer and then tried to flip it for more than it's worth. That's classic capitalism right there. The real God of America.
That is. Yeah, so it was actually true that the Egyptian Pharaoh, and this is true for the Assyrians as well because they stored grain, that you had to give a portion of your grain, of your crop, to the public welfare.
Oh, okay.
Through granaries and things like that. Here's the thing, though.
Sounds like socialism.
Yeah. Yeah, the ancient cultures were heavily socialized, for sure. So here's the thing, though, right? Okay. The way the narrative reads is like Joseph saves the day by educating Pharaoh on how to save grain.
Yeah, like I'm supposed to believe they didn't know how to do that before?
Right. We know they were already doing that. Archaeologists have been finding grain silos in Egypt hundreds and hundreds of years before Joseph ever went there.
Yeah.
So we know that they had been storing grain. They already had sophisticated methods of drying and keeping the grain preserved for years. Not just in Egypt, but in the land of Sumer, they were already doing it. We also know that there was grain storage in Turkey at the time period. So, I mean, this is nothing new. So it's odd to me, not just that the Pharaoh, who doesn't know if Joseph's interpretation is true, is going to put him as second in charge in the land, but also the advice that he gave Pharaoh was like the most common sense thing that they were already doing.
Yeah.
To me, that sounds like kind of a bit of a plot hole.
Oh, yeah.
I see I'm getting roasted in the comment section over here.
I see that.
By my own people. Guys, I'm coming for you on TikTok when I get off here. Anyways, any concluding thoughts on chapter 41?
No.
No?
I mean, what else would I say?
I mean, I'm glad we didn't read the dream all 3 times it was listed. Once was enough.
We could have.
But this, as we covered in some of the previous narratives, some of them read really well. You're like, this is kind of a believable narrative, right? This particular section of the Joseph narrative seems
pretty far-fetched.
Kind of hard to swallow.
It is, yeah.
You know what I mean? It's It's
harder to swallow than that whale that swallowed Jonah.
I was thinking about the 7 cows that swallowed the other 7 cows, but
yours was even better. That's not really fair.
That's right. We got there eventually.
Yeah.
I know. You know, we do what we can. But yeah, I mean, there's some plot holes, man. There's some plot holes in this. Yeah. Anyways, guys, thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. As always, we're here every Monday night. We're going to be back in a week, and we're going to be covering chapter 42.
Yeah.
And in just a couple more weeks, we're actually going to be on the Exodus finally.
Wow, it's only been 9 months, 10 months, 11 months.
I know. The Exodus is really exciting because when we get to the book of Exodus, we can actually start looking at like archaeology and how different things show up in history. Whereas the book of Genesis, almost everything is kind of conjecture. Like it's just
I think I'll enjoy that. Being able to actually leave it.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyways, guys, thanks for being here. We'll see you in a week. Have a great night.
Bye, guys.